Today we're looking at how to factor trinomials. So we're looking at some specific trinomials that look like this. They're in the form of x squared plus bx plus c, where b and c are real numbers. So they're always going to be in this type of form, and we're going to learn how to factor trinomials that look like this. So to begin, let's just look at x plus 5 times x plus 7. So if we were to use the FOIL method for x plus 5 times x plus 7, we would get x squared plus 12x plus 35. Let's take a look at a couple of really neat things. Notice that 5 times 7 is 35, right? So your constants, 5 times 7, they tell us that this is 35 because 5 times 7 is 35. But notice that if you add those constants together, you get this number in front of x. 5 plus 7 is 12. Now, for any trinomial in the form of x squared plus bx plus c, this is always going to work. You're going to get your c by multiplying these constants, and you're going to get your b by adding those constants. So that fact alone is going to help us factor many trinomials. So again, this 12 that happens in front of the x, the number that's in front of x, is going to be the sum of the constants that you multiply. And whereas your c value is the product of the constants. So the b value is the sum of the constants, and the c value is the product of the constants. Remember, sum means to add, and product means to multiply. So these are the steps on factoring a trinomial that is in the form of x squared plus bx plus c. The very first thing is we want to write the factors of the first term. And then the second thing we want to do is we want to find factors of the constant term, which is c, whose sum is going to be b, which is the number in front of that middle term. Write these factors as the last terms in the binomials. And then our last step is just to check our answer. If we look at our answer and we multiply our answer together, we should end up with our original problem. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say we want to factor x squared minus 5x plus 6. So the first thing we do is we write the factors of our first term, which is x squared, as the first terms in the binomials. So we're setting up two binomials. Here's going to be our first binomial, and here's going to be our second binomial. And so we want factors of x so that way we can get x squared. So x times x is x squared. That's why we're going to write x times x. Now we don't know what's going to be right here yet. And we don't know what's going to be right here yet. But we're going to find out in just a second. So step 2, we want to find two factors of positive 6 that add up to negative 5. So remember, product, sum, multiply to 6, add up to 5. So let's think of some multiples of 6. And let's see if we can figure out any that add up to negative 5. Well, 1 and 6, but those add up to 7. What about 2 and 3? But 2 and 3 add up to positive 5. We could use negative 2 and negative 3 because those still multiply to positive 6. But if you add negative 2 and negative 3, they add up to negative 5. So negative 2 and negative 3, those are going to be the factors that we want. So we're going to write negative 2 and negative 3 as the last terms in our binomials. So here's that negative 2, and here's that negative 3. So notice x squared, we wrote the multiples, or the factors of x squared. That was x and x. And then we wanted factors of 6 that added up to negative 5. So factors of 6 that add up to negative 5 would be negative 2 and negative 3. Because those multiply to positive 6 but add up to negative 5. So then we can check our answer by multiplying. X times x is x squared. X times negative 3 is negative 3x. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. Negative 2 times negative 3 is positive 6. So when we simplify that, we get x squared minus 5x plus 6. So it works. We checked our answer and we know that it is correct. Let's look at another example. Let's say we have y squared plus 5y minus 6. So remember, we start with, what are two factors of y squared? Well, y times y make y squared. Now we think, what are some factors of negative 6? But whatever factors we pick of negative 6, we just have to be careful and make sure that they add up to positive 5. So two factors of negative 6 whose sum is positive 5. So 6, we can do negative 6 and positive 1, but that's negative 5. We could do negative 1 and positive 6, and then that would give us positive 5. So 6 and negative 1 are the two factors of negative 6 that add up, or whose sum is positive 5. So we're going to place that 6 and that negative 1 in these binomials. So we'll have y plus 6 and y minus 1. All right, so how do we know if it's plus or minus, or positive, negative? How do we determine the signs of the factors of C, right? How do we know? So this is how we can figure it out. If the sign of C is positive, then that means the signs are the same and the factors will have the sign of the trinomial's middle term. If the sign of C is negative, then the signs will be different and the larger factor will have the sign of the trinomial's middle term. Let's look at an example of how we can use that. Let's look at x squared plus x minus 72. So we can begin with, well, what are the factors of x squared? Well, x and x. Now, we have to pick negative 72, right? So since C is negative, that means that our factors will have one positive factor and one negative factor. Remember, that's what the rule said. If your C was negative, and our C is negative, it's minus 72, then that means our factors, there will be a positive one and a negative one. So negative 72, there's a 6 and there's a 7. I'm sorry, not 6 and 7. We need to multiply two numbers to get 72, right? And we have to have a sum that's positive 1. So 9 times 8 is 72, right? And so that means the larger number has the sign of our middle term. Well, 9 is larger, which means 9 will be positive, and that means our smaller number, 8, will be negative. So that means we have 9 and 8, or negative 8. So our binomials, our answer will be x plus 9 and x minus 8. All right, let's do this one. X squared plus 3x plus 6. So for this one, we'll have x and x because those are the factors of x squared. Now, we need two factors of 6 that add up to 3, right? So two numbers that multiply to 6 but add up to 3. So there's no such thing. There's no two numbers that multiply to 6 that add up to 3. So when you get to this situation, you say this trinomial is prime. It doesn't factor. All right, so the first step in factoring a polynomial is to make sure that you factor out any common monomial factors. So remember back in 10.1, we learned how to factor out the greatest common factor. Make sure that anytime you have a polynomial or a trinomial, factor out the greatest common factor before you try to factor it using the method that we're learning here in 10.2. And then when your constant term is a large number, a more organized approach may be helpful. For example, if you have 2a squared minus 64a minus 288, that's a really large constant term. So the first thing we want to do is we want to factor out any common monomials. So each of these terms, they share a factor of 2. So we're going to factor out the common factor of 2. And when we do, we're left with a squared minus 32a minus 144. And that's much nicer to work with. Now that we have that, we can use the method that we've been learning in 10.2 to factor a squared minus 32a minus 144. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 144 but add up to negative 32. Okay, so the factors of 144 that have a sum of negative 32 is going to be 4 and 36, because 4 times 36 is 144, and we have to make one of them negative. So because 36 is larger, it's going to share the sign of our middle term. Our middle term is negative, so that means 36 is negative, and our smaller number is positive. So that means that 4 and negative 36, which makes sense because 4 plus negative 36 is negative 32. So those are our binomials. Make sure to remember to check your answer by multiplying. If I were to multiply this out, I should get my original question. Some trinomials contain two variables. When factoring a trinomial that has two variables, which means it looks something like this, notice that we don't just have a c, but we also have a y squared at the end, or another variable squared. And then that variable also ends up in our middle term as well. Be sure to include a factor of y in that second term of each binomial. So remember how we have that second term and we figure out that second term by finding the product of c that adds up to b? Well, make sure that when you find those numbers that you don't just write those numbers, but you also write the factor y for the second term of those binomials. Let's look at an example of that. Let's say we have x squared plus 11xy plus 24y squared. So we start with making sure that x squared, we have the factors of x. So that's x and x. And then y squared, we have the factors of y squared, y and y. Now we're looking for, we need two factors of 24 that add up to 11. So 3 and 8 multiply to 24 and add up to 11. So those are the numbers that we're going to put in our binomial. But look how I remember to put in the factor y there as well. All right, go ahead and try some problems on your own.